So thank you for inviting me. Good morning.
Good morning.
I am told that these days your age is the most sleep-deprived segment of the population. So I'm going to speak loudly and then I'm going to engage you so you don't conk out. So you're learning about Jewish culture. That is very thrilling. When I was in school, public schools rarely learned about other cultures. So this is a great thing. I'm really very thrilled that Central is doing this. Some basics, some very basics about Judaism and Jewish culture. It is the oldest surviving religion at the moment in the world. There have been others more ancient than it, but they are not around. Christianity and Islam emerged from Judaism. Judaism seems to have started out among a loose confederation of tribes and people who were connected by social circumstances and some common beliefs. Over time, they intermarried with themselves and had restrictions on intermarriage with people who did not share beliefs. And so a point was reached where Jewishness was an ethnic group, kind of an ethnic group. That ended or started to end with the dispersal of the Jewish people when their land was taken over by the Romans. And at that point, slowly over time, what was an ethnic group became a very mixed ethnic group because people who felt like joining the Jewish people would join them from various different ethnic groups. So today, although there is a slight, I'd have to ask a biologist, there is an ethnic component to being Jewish, because you have ancestors who might be Jewish. There's also plenty of people whose genes come from other places, whose ancestors converted in. So Judaism today is on the verge of kind of an ethnic group, kind of a faith tradition. And when I say faith tradition, it is distinct from other Western faith traditions in that Jews generally do not share beliefs. The Jewish people as a whole generally do not share beliefs. What they share are practices. So Jews disagree on all sorts of interpretations and all sorts of the Bible, of rabbinic literature. That's kind of a hallmark of the Jewish faith tradition. What they share are practices. Now, the period of time, I understand you were looking into some of the videos about Jews in Europe in particular, and it's important for me to say that the Jews in Europe are one part of the Jewish civilization, if you will, the Jewish culture. Many Jews lived in the Near East and North Africa, and their experience in the world was very different. Jews in Europe, in the early part of their stay in Europe, there was, when the Roman Empire converted to Christianity, there was basically one church, and it was the Jews' relationship with that one church that basically defined how they lived in Europe. And then with the Reformation, that changed. You might have learned about the Reformation. So that changed, depending on the country, whether it stayed Catholic or became Protestant, that changed. And the politics in Europe really impacted how the Jews lived. So, in places like Germany and Holland, which had experienced the Reformation, Jews over a period of time felt themselves to be ultimately citizens of a nation state. They felt themselves to be citizens of a nation state, but that was a slow historical process. There didn't used to be a lot of nation states. There used to be empires. But over time, in places like Germany and Holland, and later in France and in England, Jews felt themselves to be citizens of this nation state like the other citizens. But in Eastern Europe, that was until relatively recently, till the end of World War I, was controlled by these vast multi-ethnic empires, the Tsarist Empire, the Austro-Hungarian empires. There was not the same, Jews didn't feel part of a nation state because the nation state wasn't as relevant. You were a subject of the Tsar, or you were subject of the Kaiser, you're subject of the Emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and you were one ethnic group among many. But you didn't have the same. You weren't a patriotic French citizen or a patriotic English citizen, because the nation states didn't emerge until after World War I. And in different parts of Europe, Jews' relationship to the culture outside was different. So you did have, until the middle of the 19th century, the early part of the 19th century, you had ghettos in large parts of Europe, in Italy, in large parts of Europe. Jews were separated out, and they lived in different parts of cities and towns. In the empires in the East, in Russia, in the Tsarist Empire, and what we call now Eastern Europe, there was what was called the Pale of Settlement. And it was this vast stretch of area that Jews were allowed to settle in. They weren't allowed to settle in any other parts of the empire. They weren't allowed to settle in any other parts of the Tsarist Empire. And the Tsarist Empire at that point, by luck, it was just by luck. The Tsar wanted to conquer a large chunk of Europe, and the Tsar happened to conquer a large part of Europe that had a very, very large Jewish population. Didn't think about it when he went out to conquer things, because he just wanted to conquer things. It was what was then part of Poland, and it was a difficult relationship, because prior to the Tsar conquering that part of Europe, the Russians had almost no experience with Jews. The Russians had almost no experience of Jews. East of Poland, there were very few, if any, Jews, and the Russians didn't know what to do with them. They were aliens from other planet, and that started in the 18th century until the end of World War I. It was a very difficult relationship, and the Jews in that part of Russia fared poorly. At the same time, while anti-Semitism was really big there, anti-Semitism was endemic to Europe. Jews were these different people. They were perceived as a different ethnic group, because at this point there wasn't a lot of intermarriage between non-Jews and Jews in Europe. And Jews were perceived as this different ethnic group. And so the anti-Semitism was very common, The difference was that Jews, beginning in the 19th century, started slowly but surely coming into those societies in England and France and Holland, and became among the more liberal or progressive non-Jews of the time. They saw the Jews as citizens of the state who happened to have a different religion. And that was the process, that progressive process that started happening before the Holocaust, so that by the time you reached the Holocaust, there were lots of Jews who just thought themselves citizens of whatever country they were in. And they knew that there was anti-Semitism out there, but they were Hungarian citizens, they were German citizens, they were Dutch citizens. They felt like anyone, a Jewish person in America, would feel about being a citizen here. And they made great contributions to European culture. They absorbed a lot of European culture. They learned Shakespeare, Mahler conducted symphonies in Vienna. The contributions and the cultural exchange back and forth went to such an extent that Jews in different countries in Europe were a lot like Jews in America. Up until the Holocaust. When all of a sudden Jews were once again the different ethnic group, they were a different race. They weren't even human. But until that point, there was a process, and it was going forward. And Jews really did acculturate to European culture. That is a great question. One of the great dividing lines, if you will, among Jewish denominations today is what is called Jewish status. The question of who is a Jew, and how do you figure that out? Traditionally, at least as of the 1st century AD, at least probably a little before, yes, You were Jewish if your mother was Jewish. There's lots of scholarly ink spilled on why that happened. Because if you read the Bible, it seems, the Bible never says this. The Bible never says this. But it seems in the Bible that it goes by the father. So when did this transition happen and why is the subject of a lot of scholarly debate. It is really unclear, but because in the first century AD, all these rabbis got together, and the first century AD is the point at which the Romans conquer what is then the land of Israel, today the land of Israel, and destroy Jerusalem, destroy the temple in Jerusalem, which at that point was the center of Jewish culture and religion. Once that's destroyed, Jews have to figure out what are they going to do, are they going to keep being Jewish, are they going to do something else? So that is kind of a watershed moment where you need to figure out what happens next. And around that time, unclear exactly when, the rabbis decided that if your mother was Jewish, you were Jewish. And today, there are a couple of Jewish denominations who say no. Say that was, first century AD, we get it. So today, there are two denominations that says you can be Jewish through your father, but you got to do A, B, C, D, and E. So it is, and it depends on the rabbi of those communities. These are the Reform and Reconstructionist movement. It depends on the rabbis in those communities what they think that should be. So they get to decide. For the Orthodox and conservative movements, if your mother is Jewish and your father's not Jewish, and you have never stepped foot in a synagogue, and you know no Hebrew, and you never met another Jew before, it doesn't matter. The rabbis decided if your mother is Jewish, you are Jewish. Gotcha. It's a different, and again, it might be, those two denominations might say, oh, it's kind of a faith tradition. It's what they're doing. And the other one still has roots in family ties, it could be. But today it's one of those great questions we are currently debating. It's a good question. And not a good answer from we still don't know why that happened. That's a great question. Yiddish is the quintessential Jewish language post-Hebrew, and it developed in German-speaking countries way before there were nation states, among people who spoke. And Jews learned this, I forget, a linguist will remind me, it's Low German, Low Middle German, an ancestor of the German spoken today, and after the Jews living in those countries adopted it, for reasons, I don't know, it spread all over Europe. It became the language of the Jewish people. It is a Germanic language in Hebrew letters with a lot of Hebrew vocabulary. You could get by in Yiddish without knowing too much Hebrew vocabulary. You can't get by in Yiddish without knowing a whole lot of German vocabulary. Does anyone take German? Only one person. It's, thank you. Jamie is in my synagogue. It's good to know you take German. It is the type of German, it comes from the type of German that has English word order. So German has case endings. Does anyone take a language that has case endings? It doesn't matter. Yiddish is it's an easier Germanic language to learn because it follows English word order. And dropped all the, Germans don't think it's complicated, but English dropped all the complicated German case endings. And from Yiddish grew literally a civilization, a culture that at least 1,000 years old, and the literature is vast. There's Yiddish movies. There are Yiddish westerns, yes. In Poland, as soon as they got movie cameras in the 20s, there was a Yiddish movie, a Yiddish film industry, and they made westerns. One of the great things is to watch a western in Yiddish. It's like, blows your mind. But that's where Yiddish came from. And Yiddish was the language of the Jewish people until the Holocaust. and it's now still spoken. But in Israel, there was a great debate when the state was being founded about what the language would be. And there are a lot of people who thought it should be Yiddish, because that's the language that Jews spoke in Europe. But Jews in North Africa and the Near East, they did not speak Yiddish. They were not exposed to German culture. So they went with Hebrew. And that is why lots of people, that's why we have Hebrew schools and not Yiddish schools. But I will tell you, I never learned Yiddish. I learned Hebrew, and I think I'm missing a whole lot, because it's a vast literature and it's an amazing culture. Yiddish is a European phenomenon, yes. There are kind of parallels. So like there were Jews living in Spain prior to the Inquisition, just about before Columbus set his sail, and it was a very vibrant Jewish culture in Spain. And there's a language that came out of that called Ladino, which is a Jewish Spanish. And it's kind of like Yiddish, the same thing, except it's Spanish with a whole lot of Hebrew words, but it is 14th century Spanish. So if you are taking Spanish, you will mostly get Ladino, but there are going to be some weird, and 14th century Castilian Spanish, but in any event, so yes. And there is a Jewish Arabic, which is a very similar thing, but Jews in North African areas where ultimately Arabic was spoken, they generally spoke Arabic. Their experience was very different than Jews in Europe. They were under, once the Arabs conquered North Africa and the Near East, they were under Islamic rule. They had a special status. It was a second, like the Christians, it was kind of a second-class status. But because they were not pagans, they didn't worship idols, they were left alone. And there was anti-Semitism, as you're learning about it, is a European phenomenon. It is not something, I mean, there are occasional outbursts in Islamic countries, but it was not like in Europe where it was institutionalized. And so Jews in Arabic countries, although they didn't experience modern stuff the way we, generally speaking, historians will tell me, have a much easier time of things. They didn't live in ghettos. There weren't blood libels. There was no Inquisition. So Jews living in North Africa and the Near East under Islamic rule had a much easier time. So yeah, that's a good question. Yiddish is a European phenomenon.
The Talmud?
The Torah, the prophets, the writings. The Talmud is rabbinic, so it's not quite scripture.
Okay.
That's actually a good question. The sacred scriptures in Judaism, the first 5 books of the Bible, and that takes you from creation to when Moses dies. And then there's a section of the prophets. Those are the people who succeed Moses in prophetic leadership, although prophets weren't really leaders, in their prophetic role. And then there's kind of a miscellaneous section that's called writings. And that contains miscellaneous things like the story of Esther, the story of Ruth, Psalms, books that that are not as early as Moses and don't fall into prophetic writings. The Talmud is the writings of the rabbis, the earliest writings of the rabbis. So that dates much later. That begins in like the 1st century AD. The rest of the Bible probably starts in about 1000 BC. So the exact dates are really hard to parse, but the Bible starts then, and the rabbinic writings, when they're actually written down, they were handed down orally before. That's like the 1st century. So it's separated by over 1,000 years, the rabbinic writings. It's important to remember that most people in ancient times, Jews included, did not know how to read or write. This is a modern thing. And things were passed down orally. People would sit around the campfire at night and sing the song. The Bible is sung. It's got a tune. Jamie, if you went to Jamie's bat mitzvah, she sang the parts of the Bible because that's how it started out. It was a song. And eventually it was written down. Gotcha. It was written down. But that's a good question. And the Jewish Bible is included in the Christian Bible. The Christian Bible has more books.
That's like the Old Testament and New Testament.
The Old Testament and New Testament, yes. Oh, Jewish last names. That is really good. There's similar origins to non-Jewish last names. People did not used to have last names. It was something that that developed over time. So your last name could be the place you came from. Your last name could be your father's name. Moseson, a common Jewish name, means the original person, his father's name was Moses. It could be a trade. It could be what you did for a living. But there came a point in, I think it was Germany, in the beginning of the 19th century, end of the 18th century, where all Jews had to have, if you didn't have a last name, you had to go get a last name. Because the government was doing a census, and they wanted to be able to count people, and the only way to identify people if everybody's name was Jonathan was to have a last name. So it was actually a government intervention, and everyone had to go last name. And you wanted a nice last name, and so if you had money, you would buy a nice last name, and a nice last name was something like Edelman. Edelman means someone who is genteel and suave. And if you didn't have a lot of money, you got what the government, gave you, and they do. So you got a name like Steppelman, which means somebody who has pimples on his face. So you walked into the office, and the official would sit there and say, "How much money you got?" "Oh, you pimple face." And so because the officials back then got a cut. So that's how Jews got the name, first in Germany, and then made their way through Western Europe. And Eastern Europe, I think there was a similar move, but I'm not sure. I think there was a similar move because, again, the government wanted a census to figure out how a census the way we take one. But it's a good question, yes. So that's how we got it. But plenty of people, Moskovitz, common name, that also means son of Moses, but in Russian or Polish. Cooper is someone who, what is a Cooper? It's Old English, but it's either, a shoe guy, a cobbler. Oh, a barrel maker. There you go. So that's how a lot of names, Cooper, Cooperman, that's how a lot of names came to be. And so that's an interesting question, yes. And you have recognizable Jewish names because when the officials were putting down names, they wanted to recognize who's Jewish. They wanted to be able to say, this is a Jewish person. And again, it had to do in the early 19th century with keeping records and census and knowing who people were in the German state or the German kingdom. Well, there was change, disrupted, almost stopped. I mean, you look at Jews my age, my parents understood Yiddish. My mother spoke Yiddish, my dad really didn't. My mother came from Europe, my dad's mother was born here. So he heard Yiddish, but he's second generation, third generation, whatever already, and he's speaking English. In the early 20th century, when millions of Jews and Eastern Europeans came here, there was a huge Yiddish theater, there was huge Yiddish book industry. Over time, Jews in America wanted to be American. And by the time the third generation came, they were not speaking Yiddish or reading Yiddish. In Europe, it was the Holocaust that just destroyed Yiddish culture. And there are many Jewish book centers, one of them in Massachusetts, that have huge hordes of Yiddish books, keeping them for the day when enough people will learn enough Yiddish so they can experience Yiddish literature, which is vast and deep and rich. If you saw Fiddler on the Roof or heard Fiddler on the Roof, but is not accessible, even to Jews of my generation, much less the next generation. So it is one of my great kind of disappointments that I have not learned Yiddish. And yeah, I mean, the Jewish state, Israel, there is really, the people now who really carry on spoken Yiddish are the ultra-Orthodox. They still carry it around, there's still books in it, they still teach people, but they're very, everything is focused on the religion. Yiddish literature, very little in Yiddish literature is actually focused on the religion. It's mostly written by Jews who are navigating their identity as Jews in Europe or Jews later in America. And it's all these stories, and Fiddler on the Roof it has elements of the religion in it, but it's not about today the people who speak Yiddish for the most part are very religious, and it revolves around religious activities. But Yiddish was not a religious I mean, most of it was just not religious. But nowadays, just because of the Holocaust, the only people who are speaking it. If you were to go and visit Lakewood, and you walk around the street, you'd hear Yiddish all over, or parts of Brooklyn. Judaism has denominations, like Protestants have denominations. Jewish denominations happened in Protestant countries. In Catholic countries, Catholicism doesn't have denominations. I have many friends, I grew up in New York, I have many friends who grew up Catholic. As a Catholic, you either went to the Catholic Church or you didn't. You didn't go and found another Catholic church. That's not that tradition. In Protestantism, you went to a Protestant church. If you didn't like the minister, well, there are 4 other Protestant churches. You go see which one will satisfy you spiritually. So the Jews in Protestant countries, first Germany, then Holland, then England, they kind of said, oh, lots of Jews don't like it this way. Well, let's try a different way. And so the denominations came out there. America, which, when Jews came here, was a very Protestant country. And so the different denominations here flourished. So there is the Orthodox, which is divided between modern and ultra. I grew up modern. In my day, modern Orthodoxy was the vast majority of Orthodoxy. Nowadays, it's a minority. And it's just a demographic shift. And modern Orthodox do strictly observe all the rituals and all the rules and all the holidays and keeping kosher and a strict observance of the Sabbath on Saturdays, but they're out in the world. And they go to universities and they learn how to be lawyers and they get degrees in English literature, engineering, and things like that. The ultra-Orthodox do not. They are very strictly observant and they do not touch secular things unless they have to, like in business, because if you don't have a business, then you don't feed yourself. So they have very strict boundaries between themselves and people who are not ultra-Orthodox. There's a conservative movement. The synagogue, Flemington Jewish Community Center, is affiliated with the conservative movement. And again, really a firm adherence to tradition, but the idea that tradition evolves. And that if you follow what's called the halachic process, the process of discerning the right way to do various Jewish rituals, observances, holiday, if you follow that process, then things over time can change as long as you really are very careful, you read the texts, you listen to people. The conservative movement takes a very long time to do anything for that reason. The Orthodox movement generally doesn't do anything with new things, and the conservative takes a very long time. The Reform movement, which my colleague Rabbi Foreman and his synagogue are affiliated with, are not halachic in the sense that they don't feel themselves anchored or bound by ancient texts and practices and how you deal with those. And the Reform movement is much more prophetic. It's based on the writings of the prophets. And I said that's the middle section of the Jewish Bible. First 5 books of Moses, the prophets and the writings. The prophets are like Isaiah, Jeremiah. They talk about justice. They talk about feeding the poor. That's the Reform is very anchored in the prophetic message. And there's Reconstructionist Judaism, which emerged from the conservative movement, but their view is that Judaism is a civilization. It's a civilization. Not necessarily religion, not necessarily an ethnic group, it's a civilization. The way ancient Egypt or ancient Babylonia were civilizations, Judaism is a civilization. And that's a very different approach than a faith, it's a faith tradition or it's an ethnic group. Those are the four main ones, and different people are attracted to different ones. The State of Israel was founded by people from Eastern Europe, from Russia and Poland. Russia is Russian Orthodox. Poland is Roman Catholic. There was no Reformation there. Or actually, Poland had a Reformation and they went backwards. But they had, in their view, there is one synagogue in town, and if you don't like it, you don't go. But you do not go and decide that, okay, I'm going to do a different synagogue, I'm going to be a conservative, I'm going to be a Reform Jew. That is not something that many Israelis were familiar with until they became familiar with American Judaism. So in Israel today, the different denominations, mostly Orthodox, even though most people in Israel are not Orthodox, because they come from a society or culture, or they are descended from people from a society or culture where there was one church and one synagogue, and you can go there if you want to. You don't have to go there if you don't want to, but it's not your business go and build in another place. But it's happening now in Israel. There's more different denominations in Israel than there were ever before. But that's one way where European civilization really influenced the way Jews thought about their religion. And Jews from North Africa and the Near East, when they saw like different denominations and reform, their jaws dropped. Because they were not used. There was, Islam. There was Islam. And if you wanted to go to the mosque, you did. But you did not go and build a reform mosque. You did not. There was no. So it is, to this day in Israel, it's still a hot button issue. Whereas in America, we just sort of accept that people do things differently. Well, there's much less difference between American Judaism and European Judaism. American Judaism mostly, not 100%, but mostly comes out of Europe. Because of the Holocaust, European Judaism is really small. It used to be, before the Holocaust, 1 out of 10 people living in Poland were Jewish. Almost 10% of Poland were Jews. Not necessarily observant Jews, but Jews. In Budapest, the capital of Hungary, 1 out of 5 residents on average, Buda and Pest, they're on opposite sides of a river, on average, 1 out of 5 Budapest residents were Jewish. 20% of the population. So you can imagine the number of synagogues and the number of community centers that were there. But since the Holocaust, there's no one. Or there's a very, very small community. But a lot of what we have in America today is descendant from European. The denominations all started in Europe and then came here. On the other hand, when Jews came here from Europe at the turn of the 20th century, they wanted to forget them. They generally came here because they had a miserable life back where they came from. Or if it wasn't miserable, they came and they saw America and they wanted to be Americans. So there's a lot of family lore and family history that unless you really grill your grandparents on now, a lot of stuff that remains that we'll never know. But American Judaism is, except for those who immigrated here from North Africa and the Near East, is really rooted in Europe. And mostly Eastern Europe. The big immigration happened in the 20th century from Eastern Europe. So we had a lot more people from there than we did have Jews from France or Germany and Holland. It is really interesting. When Jews entered Europe, they kind of spread in all of these different countries, but they never made it as far as like Moscow or St. Peter. Not at the point when Russia took over that huge part of Poland that had so many Jews. So there was the Russian government had little experience, so they created what's called the Pale of Settlement, which was, and you can see borders on a map, and it was in this part of the Russian Empire that Jews could settle. So they didn't live in ghettos the way they did in like Venice or Germany, where you actually had parts of the city that were set aside for Jewish settlement. They had this region which was populated by Jews. And a huge percentage of the population was Jewish in this part of Russia. And yes, there was intense anti-Semitism. There was, again, because the Russian government had little experience, there was, well, in the hazy early Middle Ages, there seems to have been a movement in the Russian church, way before they took over parts of Europe. There seemed to have a movement in the Russian Orthodox Church to adopt Jewish practices. There was some movement, nobody knows quite where it comes from or how it developed, but some priests or bishops in the Russian church decided we ought to do Jewish practices. And a great debate ensued, and a great fight ensued, and they lost, what are called the Judaizers. But everything they wrote was burned. And all the people who were like their leaders were killed. So it is really unclear what the impetus was that, and that was centuries and centuries before. So all the Russian people had was this memory of these guys who were trying to introduce Jewish practices, like the Sabbath or something like that. And they were taught it was a terrible, terrible thing, because the winners took control of the church. That is the only exposure Russians ever had prior to the middle of the 18th century, and that kind of colored, they didn't know anyone else. So this was why there's always a really bad situation for Jews when they were living under the Tsar. Yes. Yeah. It's a very interesting history. It was kind of stories that came down, not real people, which is a lesson. You make a decision about somebody, not by stories that are coming down, but by actually engaging them in conversation, which the Tsar's government did not do. Rabbis. There are female rabbis in all denominations except Orthodox. However, within certain modern Orthodox synagogues today, there are female rabbis. And that is one of the great raging debates within Orthodoxy. And all the other denominations do ordain women. Yeah. You can Google that and find fights, real fights, yes. Maybe, but it's the Orthodox who really insist on maternal, matrilineal descent through the mother, and they are totally against women rabbis. Yeah, it's not consistent in that way. It changed. First, we lost Yiddish and all that literature. 1 out of 3 Jews were murdered in 7 years. So 1 out of 3 Jews were murdered between 1938 and 1945. So that changed everything. And when you lose 1 out of 3 in a group, so much changes. So much changes. Until very recently, if you were a Jew living in America and you weren't particularly observant, then the way you were Jewish was, 1, you remembered the Holocaust, and 2, you supported the state of Israel. That's how you expressed your Judaism in America if you didn't go to synagogue on Yom Kippur, or you didn't have Passover, or you didn't do Hanukkah, or something like that. Those were the 2 things that really you identified with as being Jewish in America. But nowadays that is all up for grabs. The Holocaust is still very significant, but it's kind of receding in time. You need something to anchor you in your faith tradition, your community. And this is, it's already 80 years ago, so it's receding in time, and Israel has become much more divisive subject among Jews. In fact, rabbis always tell you you can talk to a rabbi about eating pork, and you can talk to a rabbi about never coming to shul, but if you want to talk to a rabbi about Israel, you got to go meet him in the Dunkin' Donuts 30 miles away from his synagogue, because it just raises too many problems. Israel today is a real hot issue among Jews because of what's going on today. But until recently, the way, unlike before the Holocaust, where there was no state of Israel, in America, those were the two big ways you identified. Yeah, so it is changing. It is changing. There are not. There are rituals. But none of them are considered. None of them have the status of a sacrament. So there are a lot of rituals, but no, not sacraments in that sense. In that sense, there are a lot of rituals, but not none of them are sacraments in that sense. Lighting candles on Friday night to welcome the Sabbath. The Sabbath is a time when you are not supposed to work. That means no homework too. That means no school. The Sabbath is a time of complete rest. A ritual would be, there's a wedding ceremony, a traditional Jewish marriage. That is a ritual. There is, there's bar mitzvah. That is a ritual. Someone said something. Another ritual. A bris, a circumcision. That is a ritual. There are blessings over wine and over food. Those are all ritual blessings. So Judaism has a lot of lighting the menorah. That's a ritual. Sitting down to a Passover meal, Passover Seder. If you've ever had a chance to do that, it's a ritual which involves many more rituals, like dipping things and making blessings over wine and making blessings over matzah, unleavened bread. So there are a lot of rituals, but they don't quite get to the level of sacraments. Oh yeah, Passover is coming up. If you have the opportunity to attend a Passover Seder, it's a great thing. Passover celebrates liberation. It is when the Jews who were slaves in Egypt are freed. So Passover is the holiday when Jews are liberated from their slavery in Egypt. And to mark that occasion, we sit down to a Passover Seder. Seder literally means order. And you sit down to this meal, and you have a booklet called a Haggadah, and you go through step by step a very ordered meal with a lot of rituals and a lot of symbolism. And you go through it. You start with making a blessing on the wine. You tell the story of liberation from Egypt. You were slaves, now you're free. And then there's all these associated rituals. It's springtime. You're celebrating spring, so you have parsley, a green vegetable. You have a mixture called charoset, which is supposed to remind us of the mortar out of which the slaves had to make bricks in Egypt. You eat matzah, the unleavened bread. It's flour and water. It doesn't rise. And it is the bread of poverty, of slaves. It's also the bread that the children of Israel took with them out of Egypt, because once Pharaoh agreed to free them, he said, you have to leave now. And so the bread that they were making for the next day, they just put on their shoulders and left the country. It didn't have a chance to rise. So it stayed, it's a cracker, if you've ever seen matzah. And yes, it is literally liberation theology. That is literally what Passover is about. Literally, it's about that. If you ever get a chance to do a Seder, it's a really interesting experience. They did. Some people did people try to hide their Jewishness during the Holocaust? The answer is yes. Some people got away with it, but most people did not. And it's part of the whole the very sad story, the very troubling story of how people were identified as Jews, and it went very slowly. Jews had to register. If you didn't register, you were put in jail. So wouldn't you want to register? But once you registered with the German government, then the government knew you were Jewish. But it's not like in 1936, they knew that in 1940, you'd be shipped to a death camp. So, yes, they did, but by the time they kind of figured what might be going on, it was a slow process. And so it mostly did not work. It mostly did not work. And then there were people who did not know that they were Jewish because the Nazis defined Judaism as one grandparent. So we have 4 grandparents. So only one grandparent made you Jewish. But if the Jewish tradition defines you Jewish as what your mother is, then why should anybody for whom one grandparent is Jewish, why would they think? So it was also a lot of people who didn't think they were. It was, as you learn about the Holocaust, it's it's among the many very troubling things, step by step. It was step by step. And Jews tried to hide their identity in other instances as well, just to pass in society. So in the 18th, 19th century, as Jews acculturated, a lot of them hid their Jewishness so that they could be parts of certain professions or go to university. It took a while for universities to let Jews in. It took a while for professions to let Jews in to practice law and things like that. So yeah, Jews have tried to do that for a long time. It's interesting, the bar and bat mitzvah, it's one of those things, we said it was a ritual, but I'm going to take it back. Maybe it's not a ritual. You become bar or bat mitzvah as soon as you hit 13. The moment you have your 13th birthday, you are responsible for yourself Jewishly as an adult. So Jewishly as an adult, you should be doing the Jewish things you're supposed to do. You do not need a party. You do not need an announcement in the synagogue. You do not need to come up and lead services. You hit 13, that's it. You are enough of an adult to be responsible for your behavior. Over the course of time, and it's late. I mean, this big thing around the bar mitzvah, it's maybe 200-300 years old, maybe. I mean, I know that sounds like a long time, but if Judaism goes back to 1000 BC, it's not. Yes, you did have a lot of youth activity, but maybe not necessarily in the synagogue. In Europe, synagogues were, except in the big cities, Berlin and Budapest that had really big synagogues. Outside of big synagogues were small affairs. And so they were there for ritual, they were there for praying, and they were there for learning. And yet there were meetings there, but when you had something big, a community, there were you met in people's homes, or you met in other buildings that weren't the synagogue. They did not have like big spaces the way we do. They didn't have big spaces the way we do. 1948, 3 years after World War II, the State of Israel is established. And at that point, there are about 650,000 Jews living in Israel. A large chunk, the largest chunk, comes from Europe. But there are Jews living in the state of Israel. The boundaries we have today was never empty of Jews. There was always Jewish communities in Israel. So even after the Romans came and deported most of the Jews, so there were always in cities, Tiberias in the north and Hebron in the southeast or the central east. In Jerusalem, there were always Jewish communities there from that date back thousands of years to when Israel was an independent country. So they were there as well. You did have indigenous Jews whose families never left. But yes, most of the people at the founding of the state came from Europe. And then after the armistice was signed, after the War of Independence, there was, in the early 50s, there was a huge influx of Jews from Arabic-speaking countries, from North Africa, from the Near East. And they actually, by the end of the 50s, Jews from North Africa and the Near East were the majority. Were the majority in Israel, within by the mid 50s, early 50s. There were Jews who immigrated from the United States, but not a huge amount. Not a huge amount.
More so now, right?
More so now. There's more so now. The biggest population influx in the history of the State of Israel came when the Soviet Union collapsed. When the Soviet Union collapsed, all these Jews emigrated from there to Israel, from former Soviet republics too. So not just from Russia, from wherever the Soviet Union had its control, and so now a huge portion of the Jewish or the European, a huge portion of the Israeli citizenry is from Russia or former Soviet republics. It's really quite large. Before that, the biggest ethnic group was Moroccans. Was from Morocco. So if anyone ever visits Morocco, it's a fascinating place, and there's still a Jewish community there. But that was before the Soviet Union fell. That was the biggest group. So Israel, only for a brief period in its history, was mostly of European descent. After the first few years of the state, it was Jews from Arab countries who made up the majority. And now I'm not so sure. It may be that Jews from the former Soviet Union may now make up the biggest ethnic group. I'm not 100% sure. But yeah, so, for Jews coming from all these different countries and all these different cultures, and it is kind of a multi-ethnic place in a sense. At the very least, they fight all the time. There's a lot of, between Jews of Moroccan descent and Russian descent, and Jews who come from Western countries like France or the United States, there are real difficult disagreements. And then you have disagreements between the religious people in Israel and the vast majority of Jews who are not religious. Or the Orthodox, which is about 10% these days, 15%, and the other 85, 90% that are not. That's another big, deep divide. So, and that doesn't even go into the Jewish-Muslim controversy. And so it is... It can be a difficult place. It's a small country with a lot of different people, so it can be difficult to navigate. It can be difficult to navigate. A traditional Jewish marriage has to involve an exchange of something valuable so that the couple pledges economic support to each other. There are traditionally 7 blessings that you need to do at a traditional Jewish marriage. And then there are other ones that actually they are. The third big one is the chuppah, which is standing underneath a canopy that symbolizes you're establishing a home together. So those are the 3 important rituals that happen in a Jew, and you'll see it in almost all. I'm trying to think if I remember. You'll see it in almost all Jewish weddings. That is a later ritual. Well, I don't know. Actually, that might be a very ancient ritual. At the very, very end of a Jewish wedding, and you may kiss the bride, or whatever you do. After all that, you stomp on a glass, and you break a glass. And traditionally, it's explained that since very ancient days, because the sacred temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, we just have to remember that even though it's a wedding and everybody's happy, there are things in the world that are not going well. We live in an imperfect world. There's poverty. There's injustice. And so you break the glass so everybody knows that even though it's a happy occasion, there's a world out there, and the world is a very far from perfect place. One scholar thinks that it's an old European custom to chase away demons, because everybody knows that demons, if they see you're happy, they're going to come and make you unhappy. So the way you chase the demons is you take a glass that's worth something and you break it, and the demons will go, they can't be that happy because they just broke a glass, and that cost them $4. So the demons there don't interrupt the wedding and leave you alone. So there's superstition, a lot of superstition about, if that's the original reason, we're not sure. That also that also informs rituals, even if we don't believe them anymore, because the ritual has been done at every single wedding we've ever been to. People insist at the end of the wedding they're going to break the glass. Judaism has a lot of holidays. If you're the oldest faith tradition in the West, you have ancient holidays that go back to 1000 BCE or so, and then, you know, new events happen and new things happen, and so there are new holidays coming up, and so the Jewish calendar gets filled with holidays. The high holidays are in the Bible. The high holidays are in the Bible. It talks about Yom Kippur, which is a fast day, a day of atonement, which means a day of seeking forgiveness for whatever things bad you did that year. Rosh Hashanah, the new year, is the day you blow the the shofar. If you've ever seen a shofar, it's a ram's horn, and it's mentioned in the Bible, and we do exactly what the Bible says. We blow the shofar. And those have come to be like the high holidays are called high holidays because that's when Jews who have very little observance, they come to synagogue on those days. Those are the big days they come. But in the past, different holidays were important during different times. Passover was the biggest holiday, as from what we can tell in Europe. It wasn't that Yom Kippur wasn't important or Rosh Hashanah was important, but Passover, that was the thing, everybody. That was that. So over time, the emphasis changes, but we have the high holidays, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, which come within 10 days of each other. We have the holiday of Tabernacles. It is a harvest holiday, and we build huts. If you have ever seen a sukkah, if you have not, it's something interesting. You build the hut because when the children of Israel were wandering in the desert and they were left Egypt, they hadn't yet come to the land of Israel, they lived in these lean-tos. So traditionally, we build this lean-to structure, and we eat all our meals in it for 7 days. It probably is also related to the harvest festival, farmers being out in their fields and not being able to return home. And they'd build these lean-tos so the next morning they could finish their harvest. So it could be both. There is the holiday of Pentecost, Shavuot. Pentecost is also mentioned in Christian literature, but in the Jewish literature, it means it is the first harvest of the year. And it happens 50 days after Passover. So Pentecost is Penta for 50, happens 50 days after Passover, and it's the first harvest of the year, and everybody's happy because you're bringing in a harvest. And those are biblical holidays. And then later, new things happen, and so the holiday of Purim. We just had Purim. Purim is like a cross between Mardi Gras and St. Patrick's Day. And it's when the Jews of Persia were rescued from an evil person who wanted to kill them. And Queen Esther is the hero of the story, and she rescues her people from destruction. And then Hanukkah, which a lot of you have heard about because it happens around Christmas, and that is when the Maccabees beat the Greeks or the Syrian Greeks and were able to restore the temple to Jewish worship. Apparently, the Greeks had taken over the Jewish temple and instituted a Greek sacrificial cult in the temple. The Maccabees beat them, conquered the temple, cleaned it, and we celebrate Hanukkah because we got the temple back. So Hanukkah and Purim are later than the Bible, but they were incorporated because these are great events, and we're very happy that we won, and we weren't destroyed, and we were big. So they become really important holidays. And other holidays will probably be added as things happen. In a faith tradition, and this goes for all faith traditions, not just the Jewish tradition, it's much easier to add something than to subtract it. It's really hard to get rid of something once people are doing it because people grow attached to a particular holiday, a particular prayer. It's really hard. So the Jewish prayer book is this thick because over the course of 3,000 years, some say, oh, that's a really excellent psalm. We're going to use that. Oh, that's a really excellent quote. We're going to use that. And okay, that's fine. But 300 years later, people going, what's so great about that? What's so great? It's in there. And you can't take it out because Joe's grandfather, that was Joe's grandfather's favorite hymn. And if you take it out, Joe is leaving the synagogue. So, okay, we'll leave it in. And it's much easier to keep adding things in a faith tradition as take them out. The thing is that, as if any of you have experienced Jewish services in a tradition, our synagogue, they're longer than your traditional. Well, they're longer than a high mass if you've ever attended a high mass, so they can be long. The Reform movement has very wisely cut it down to about an hour, but the traditional services in conservative Orthodox synagogues, let's see, they can be 2.5 hours, 2 3/4 hours. Which is why Jews in traditional synagogues don't always come at the beginning of services. In the Holocaust, if they could. So there are records from ghettos where people try and do Hanukkah and people try and do Passover. There are even records in the death camps where people try to do Hanukkah somehow, but only if you had the physical means, the physical strength to do it. So they made attempts. There are stories about this in Holocaust literature about attempts being made to do that, yeah. But for the most part, no. Oh, well, the Holocaust affected being kosher where you didn't have anything to eat, so you ate anything you could. There is a rule in Judaism that you obey all the rules, but not to the extent that you sacrifice your life. So a human life is more important than any rule. So if you are in a situation that's life-threatening, you do anything to save your life. But keeping kosher is a strong tradition. It goes back to the Bible, the book of Leviticus, what animals you can eat, what animals you can't eat. Despite all the explanations, nobody knows why the lobster you can't eat and the pig you can't eat and the cow you can eat and the lamb you can eat. Those it was perhaps understandable to the original audience of the book of Leviticus, but they're no good reason. They are there. But over time, as modern times came, Jews looked at people around them, and a lot of Jews became less observant. My teacher, Rabbi Art Green, who ordained me, is of the opinion that before the Holocaust happened, his opinion is most Jews in Europe were not observant. They were very strongly Jewish, but they did not observe every piece of Jewish practice that has been handed down to them. And today, the vast majority of Jews, they don't keep kosher, or they keep kosher in certain ways. And so over time, especially in America, observance has waned. But if the Holocaust had not happened and Jews were still in Europe, my teacher thinks that observance would have waned means decrease, would have decreased as well. There still would have been people, keeping kosher and doing the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath, but there would have been other things that they would have identified with. Did Jewish people in North Africa have different traditions then, or beliefs than people living in Europe? They had different traditions. Different beliefs, no different than, lots of Jews I would say, pardon me, I'm not sure, I don't think so, but their practices, their traditions were different. They had slightly different ones. So they had a Passover Seder, but if you came from certain parts of North Africa, one of the traditions you had at your Seder was that you took leeks and you hit each other with the leeks, because it was a way you remind yourself of being whipped as a slave. It's an interesting tradition. It happened in Algeria and Moroccan Jews. That's what they have told me. They did this. Iranian Jews, they told me they did. In Europe, maybe because we didn't have leeks. I don't know, because the leeks in Europe in March are not that long. That's one tradition. In Jews in North Africa and also the Near East, main staple of food on a Passover Seder, rice and beans. Rice and beans. Jews in Europe did not have rice and beans. So they didn't eat rice and beans. And when they finally got rice and beans, through trade routes that had opened up with North Africa, they wouldn't eat them on Passover. Because they said, those don't look like Passover foods to us. When in fact they were the original Passover foods, and the Jews in the North African and the Near East, they were right. Those were the foods that were originally eaten for Passover Seders. But if you are living in Poland in the 15th century, you don't know what people in Iran or Iraq are eating. So different traditions developed over time. And although the basic structure is identical, the prayers you will see, you will recognize prayers and traditions and rituals. Yeah, there are differences. Indeed, differences.
The bell's going to ring in a couple
Please,
minutes.
thank you.
Thank you very much for coming out.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. We should do this again, and you should come to the synagogue. It's just to show you around.
That would be great. Thank you very much. Thank you.
You are very welcome. Thank you, guys. Take care.
Thank you.